We're back at it for the closing panel of this wonderful one-day symposium. This is a CII UB panel on misinformation and extremism that will be led and moderated by our CII colleague Yotam Ophir, assistant professor in the Department of Communication. Yotam's research combines computational methods for text mining, network analysis, experiments, and surveys to study media content and effects in the areas of political science and health communication. His work has been published in the American Journal of Public Health, the Journal of Communication, Public Understanding of Science, Journal of Public Health, Health Communication, and more. His co-author book on the 2020 presidential election, Democracy Amid Crisis, Polarization, Pandemic, Protests, and Persuasion, was published in 2023, very recently, congratulations, by Oxford University Press, not too shabby. Yotam is the head of the Media Effects, Misinformation, and Extremism Lab, and a distinguished fellow at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He will be joined by UB colleagues Lindsay Hang, Matt Kenyon, Mark Frank, and Jeannie Zhang. Please welcome Yotam and his wonderful panel.
All right, thank you. Give me a second. All right. Thank you all for being here. And especially as this is the last panel today, I want to thank the CII team and particularly David and Siwei and Cynthia, who've been working so hard since this group was just an idea that we started off over Zoom some time ago. And it's just exciting to see things become real and to see us, being here together and talking about misinformation with a very varied group of people. And by the way, I was really impressed by your group. That's fantastic. It's almost not fair to have us, go after that. All right. My biggest regret, by the way, in life, I have many, but my biggest is that we didn't have uniforms like they did. But my lab members will create us a T-shirt, right? Okay, I'm making some jokes because soon I'm going to start talking about misinformation and my tone will change. I'll follow the previous panel structure and give a short introduction with my thoughts about why we even need to be here today. And then I'll try to spend most of the panel's time letting the four people on my left the stage while I'll try to be mostly quiet. I can't promise, but I'll try. Those who've been with us today from the beginning of the event already got persuaded, I'm sure, that misinformation is nothing new. I mean, some of the examples we talked about today go back to 19th century London, but you can obviously go much more back in time. And it seems that lying and deception have been with us pretty much since we learned how to talk. But still, I think that there is a sense among all of us who study misinformation that there is something unique about this moment in time. First of all, and perhaps the most important is this: the stakes were never as high as they are now. Misinformation had been around for long, but we are at a point where believing false assertions can literally lead to the end of humanity as we know it, to the end of this planet that we live on as we know it, and to the eruption and spread of epidemics of unprecedented proportions. Second, I think recent years have shown us that all of us are experiencing things that seemed unacceptable, unreasonable until very recently. Here in our backyard a year ago, in an event that actually kind of gave us the motivation to do this panel to begin with, a person shooting down African American citizens from our own community because he believes in a conspiracy theory that Jews and feminists and liberals and the media are conspiring together to replace white people with non-whites in the United States. By the way, we're going to talk, maybe if we'll have time, about the fact that West New York is one of the hotspots of the far right these days. In addition, we experienced unbelievable levels of resistance to public health efforts during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think all of us have friends and family members who began to say weird stuff since 2020. They don't trust authorities, they don't trust doctors, they don't trust the vaccines. Some of them went as far as to argue that Bill Gates is trying to, put all kind of microchips in us, and maybe China created the virus on purpose as a bioweapon, and maybe everything at the end of the day was an attempt to derail Donald Trump's run for 2020 re-election. Now, the two things are not disconnected. The mass shooting at Buffalo's Tops supermarket and COVID-19. In fact, the far right and the extremist groups in the United States are beginning to find a lot of interest in science, and I'm using it in a very generous way, mostly in the misinformation part of science. If you think about QAnon, something that started off with a conspiracy about Hillary Clinton running a pedophilia ring from a pizzeria place in DC, but then made a turn and kind of changed its face to fit the COVID-19 epidemic. And then when COVID waned down, it found a new avenue in the election fraud argument that ended up with the Capitol riots. Now, none of these ideas are new. They're not. If you think about Pizzagate, the idea that there is a group of a cabal of pedophiles that abuse our children, you can find traces of it in the Middle Ages, in the Jewish blood libel narratives. You can find traces of it in Salem, in the witch hunt trials, and you can find traces of it in the 90s, in the satanic fears that kindergarten teachers in the United States are molesting, abusing our children. The ideas are not new, but the media environment in which they take place is. Now, many point the finger to 2016 as kind of the maybe the watershed moment when Donald Trump got into office, somebody that was, again, unimaginable, that a person with no political experience, that makes every mistake possible under the traditional rule book of politics, will become president of the United States. At the same time, people in England are voting in Brexit in what seems to be, an unreasonable, not a rational move to disconnect themselves from the European Union. And we learned in the years that follow that foreign countries like Russia, but not only Russia, many others, are polluting our information system with disinformation. But I think it's a mistake to put all the blame on 2016 or on Donald Trump. This specific brand of misinformation that we're going to talk about today, the one that's fueling the extremist groups that are now being identified in the United States as domestic terrorism, and the branch of misinformation that connects to anti-scientific ideology, can be traced back at least, I think, and probably more, but let's we'll have to settle on something. So let's say the 60s. And in the 60s, the United States begins to polarize in new ways. It's not that before that everybody was, happy and friends with one another, but since the 60s, we're moving away from one another into two camps that just can't agree on anything. In the 70s, as a pushback against all the achievements of the 60s, we see a rise in the United States, at first of the Christian right, and later on with the Reagan coalition, bringing together, big business and traditional values in kind of a surprisingly effective manner. And those groups begin to clash again and again and again with science, with experts. At first around issues like evolution and climate change, then abortion, and these days stem cell research and many other topics. Now, Reagan did another thing that I think all of my colleagues here will agree that was monumental to where we are today. He did a lot to deregulate the United States. And among the many deregulation efforts that he conducted was the repeal of the fairness doctrine. A small little idea, not perfect in any way, but one that secured the integrity of media outlets by forcing public media, not by public, I don't mean NPR, I mean cable and other news channels, to talk about politics in a balanced and fair way, giving both sides a fair amount of time to show their argument. So the fairness doctrine is removed in the 80s, and then we have a bombardment of new media and technologies that no longer play by those rules anymore. Talk radio on AM stations, Fox News in 1996, and these days OAN, Breitbart, and all those pseudo-news channels. At the same time, and I'm sorry that I make this political, but we are in a political moment, the Republican Party is changing, and people like Newt Gingrich and others are pushing us toward polarization, toward disagreement, and science and facts and integrity of information, as we call it in this center, begins to pay a price. Now, the far right that most of you are, all of you are studying in one way or another is nothing new either, and it didn't start in 2016 either. You can find the roots of it in media, but not in social media, but in books like The Turner Diaries, a novel from 1978 that tells the story of how Black people and Jews conspire together to rape white women, murder them, and replace them, and end the Western civilization as we know it. The book and other pamphlets and media were the inspiration behind clashes between militia groups and the government since the early 90s, Ruby Ridge and Waco, and the Oklahoma City bombing, and the Bundy Ranch standoff. Those seem like long time, long gone historical moments. The occupation of the Oregon National Wildlife, and many, many more. Of course, all of these have a much deeper racist and misogynistic roots, but I'm not going to go that far. And all of that is flourishing in a media environment that's greedy and competitive and unregulated. Sadly unregulated, unbelievably unregulated. Take Pizzagate, it's all about media. It starts on emails. John Podesta's emails are being hijacked and released by the Russians in an attempt to interfere with our politics, with our elections. The emails make their way to Reddit, a place where people can anonymously talk about whatever they want with very little moderation, except for some local community-based moderation. People on Reddit begin to notice something really interesting to them. John Podesta, who leads the campaign for Hillary Clinton, talks a lot about pizza. They talk about ordering pizza and having pizza. The brilliant detectives of Reddit read through the documents and come up to a certain conclusion that it must mean that there is a pedophilia ring organized around those code words that pizza represents. They have a whole dictionary, cheese is boy and sauce is orgy and stuff like that. But it doesn't stop there. Alex Jones picks it up and move it to his millions of followers on InfoWars. And then it gets to Facebook, and then it gets to Amazon. You can buy Pizzagate and QAnon books on Amazon. You can buy QAnon shirts on Amazon. And eventually it reaches real life. We see signs that say "Save the Children" at Trump rallies. We have a person who takes an AR-15, our biggest killer in this country, and marching into Comet Ping Pong in Washington, D.C., to shoot around and screaming that he is here to free the children, until he realized that the basement he was looking for, where the kids were allegedly held, that never existed. The pizzeria place didn't have a basement, despite what Reddit was saying. And then it gets to Congress with Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia and others who adopt Pizzagate and then its reincarnation as QAnon later, ideologies. And then it gets to the top of the pyramid, to the President of the United States, who says on QAnon that he doesn't know them very well, but he heard that they love the country and they're patriots and they're against pedophilia, which he appreciates. By the way, he retweeted them hundreds of times, so he did know who they were. All of that culminates in the horrific shootings that we had here in our town, and in violent incidents like the failed yet dangerous coup attempt at Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And all of it is, again, fueled by a media system that's competitively greedy, a media system that's willing to lie often to its viewers. Fox News settled this week with Dominion voting company. You all know about it, the voting machine company. Over $787 million, practically admitting that they've been lying to their audiences about election fraud in 2020. A poll, a survey done after the settlement asked viewers, do you trust Fox News less now that you know that they've been lying to you? Among Fox News viewers, 21% say yes. 79% of the viewers don't care that Fox News have been lying to them, send them to the Capitol building to clash with police officers, to kill a police officer, and to die themselves, as some protesters ended up. Yesterday, Elon Musk did not only blow a missile over the sea, 4 seconds, I think, after it was launching, but also blew our Twitter integrity to pieces by taking away verification badges from newspapers, from libraries. By the way, libraries, the LA library, for example, lost its badge. From academics, from researchers. And who gets the verification now? Every person who's willing to pay $8 a month. So for those reasons, we assembled here a group of people who understand media and extremism. This is, I think, the only panel today that's UB exclusive, maybe. And all the people here are in one way or another associated with the center. So that's a fantastic kind of way to introduce what this center is about. All right. The biggest challenge for me today is to give the introduction on all of these people, because they've done so much. And if I'll read you like the full bios that they sent me, we will get to 6 p.m. and go drink some beer together or something. So I'll do my best to do a reasonable job shortening your bios. But all four are very distinguished and very familiar with the topics that we are discussing here. I'll do it by ABC. So Mark Frank at the end is a professor of communication here at UB. He served as the chair of the department, which was lucky for me because he gave me a job back in 2019. And he is currently the faculty athletic representative. He published so much work that we can't even start talking about it, but his work is mostly on facial expressions, emotion, interpersonal deception, and also violence and extremism groups. His work was funded by the NSF, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, and many, many more, where he studies deception and emotions as can be seen in checkpoints, in law enforcement contexts, in counterterrorism situations, and extremist groups. Dr. Lindsay Han is an assistant professor at the Department of Communication, and she's the leader, I believe, of the Center for Cognitive no.
Not leader, just affiliate.
Okay, she's affiliated. She will be one day the head of the Center for Cognitive Science at UB. Her research investigates the cognitive processes surrounding media use and effects in audiences, again, with a particular focus on the role that media can play in instigating violent extremism. Her recent project focuses on understanding the manner in which violent extremism use morality as a tool for radicalization, for instance, by appealing to at-risk individuals and priming their moral concerns. Matt Kenyon is an associate professor at the Department of Art at UB and is a Buffalo-based artist whose work has been exhibited nationally and internationally. Again, if I'll count every place his work was shown at, we will never get out of here. So I'll just say his work was anywhere from the MoMA in New York to museums at Detroit and Dublin and Barcelona and more. He's a TED Fellow, a Macdowell Fellow, and his work has been awarded the FILE Prix Lux, am I saying it correctly? And was presented in leading newspapers and edited volumes. He has a studio called S.W.A.M.P. That's the swamp that Trump wanted to drain?
Drain, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it had been focusing for more than 2 decades now on critical themes addressing the effects of global corporate operations, mass media and communication, military industrial complexes, and general meditations on the limited area between life and artificial life. Last but not least, Yini Zhang is also a professor of communication here at UB, who uses computational methods to study big data and really provide a zoom out kind of bird view of the complex environment in which media is being diffused and amplified. Her current research program centers around the ways people express themselves and interact with one another, the ways information flows between social media platforms, and the factors that shape social media communications. So again, I think it's a fantastic way to close today's meeting with a discussion with these 4 people who are at the heart of academic research into the problems that I talked about before, and the problems that are that the center has put at the top of our concerns and aims. All right. So I talked way more than I intended. I'll pass the microphones to you. If you want to first just introduce yourself and specifically tell people how your work is related to misinformation and extremism. You can choose the order.
Want me to start? All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Hahn, and yeah, as Yotam introduced, I study morality in general and other cues and messages that can lead people to alter their social behavior. And so recently I've been focusing a lot on how do bad guys persuade otherwise good guys to join their causes? What types of messages do they have to use to persuade them to do bad things? And so we focused a lot recently on things like how does threat and how does convincing somebody that their cause is morally righteous lead people to be able to, you know, overcome their ability to not want to harm people to, you know, doing something harmful like shooting up a pizza parlor or storming the Capitol or, you know, committing a mass shooting.
Hi, my name is Ini Zhang. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication. I do research on how individuals and organizations and groups use social media to gain attention, to attract followers, and eventually to accumulate influence. So if you think about what like misinformation actors and what like conspiracy theory believers do, they use social media to do those things. So I think in that regard, my research can speak to this issue of the spread of misinformation and rise of extremism in American society today.
Hi, I'm Matt Kenyon. I think I might be the only artist and designer today. I like to tell people that I'm attracted to media and technology because I'm excited by the power that they hold, and I'm also sort of repelled by the power that media holds. And my own studio is called SWAMP, and it stands for Studies of Work, Atmospheres, and Mass Production. And I work in a range of materials and processes from robotics, optics, to simple ink on paper. And I have a project I'll share with everyone today that they get to leave the conference today with part of the project as well. I'll talk about later. Oh, yeah.
And yeah, so I'm Mark Frank. I've been studying deception for almost 30 years at a more interpersonal level. So what do people do? What do they look like when they lie? How good are we at detecting lie and working lies and working with various federal agencies over the years, both from a law enforcement and intelligence point of view. And some of the stuff that's more, so it's more interpersonal than maybe the more mediated, like my colleagues work on. But some of the principles I think that come out of the interpersonal, like why do people believe stuff? Why are people taken in by lies and so on? And what goes into the mind of somebody who decides to do this stuff? So for example, we had a little documentary out there on Curiosity Stream called Inside the Mind of a Con Artist, where we tried to look through how do they go about doing their thing that gets people to go along with them and convince them and so on. And a lot of those same basic interpersonal principles, I think we sometimes see on the larger scale that my colleagues here are more expert on than me. So yeah, this has been fairly interesting. And then of course, we're also looking at how some of these messages come across that produce violence in groups too. What is the combination of factors in a speech given by a leader or a group that ends up turning those followers into killing other people, and including various genocidal events? And what about the leaders that where they don't turn violent? And there are some measurable differences in these things, and maybe this will come up later, but turn it back to the crowd.
So the I'll start with a broad question. The main goal that we set for ourselves in the center was to help change the information environment as much as we can to make it cleaner and more accurate and fight misinformation. If you can speak a little bit about how your work, academic or artistic or otherwise, help us achieve that goal. How can we, as participants in the center, can make the information environment cleaner?
Do you want to just go ahead and say more? Yeah, so in a lot of the spaces that I work in, there is a famous saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And the idea behind that is that, you know, whether or not what you're doing is good or bad is kind of dependent upon whose side you're on. So we all look at these bad actors because we're sensible people. and we know that what they're doing is bad, but the people who are, you know, on their side, or the people themselves that are doing these things, think that what they're doing is morally righteous. And so what my work is really trying to do to kind of help clean up the landscape here is to point to the importance of morality in messages and how morality can kind of spark behavior. So what I usually tell people who ask the question of so what can we do here, is that, you know, even if you think you're sort of combating information that is morally charged by coming at it and telling the you know, communicator why it's wrong, and trying to persuade them that, you know, they are morally wrong, that what that really kind of does is just fuel the fire. And so what we've found time and time again, sometimes unexpectedly in our research, is that kind of turning down the temperature in communication, whether it be in entertainment media or social media, and getting away from these morally charged messages and kind of presenting people with facts is really the best way to go about kind of cleaning up the muck that's out there.
So based on my research, I think the efforts to counter misinformation and extremism can come from like multiple fronts. For example, in terms of social media and what they can do, I think changing the design of social media, changing the digital architecture of social media can be one first step. Like based on a lot of research, we can see that a lot of features of social media and affordances, such as a number of followers, number of retweets, a number of like shares, those metrics can drive people crazy. People can be attracted to gaining attention, to like accumulate a lot of followers and retweets, and that can get them into posting things that are more like inflammatory and more extreme. And also think about individuals and how individuals can do information literacy, media literacy. I think that can be one important step for for average people to take. And based on our research, we show that a lot of times, just like what Dr. Han's research has found, like people are driven by like emotion, but driven by some like desire to like own their opponents, to dunk on their opponents, and that desire, that impulse, can make them, do things that are, stupid, can make them like spread misinformation or disinformation. And lastly, I think we can think about like leaders, political leaders, changing like media system, looking at the I would say the bigger picture. Based on the research that I've been doing, we can see that like the rise of, let's say, like antipathy or hostility towards immigrants, for example, in the United States, has a lot to do with the rhetoric coming from Donald Trump, with like the coverage from right-wing media that portray immigrants as a drain, as a danger to this country. So I think, again, like to clear the cesspool that is of our that is a feature of our information system today, we need to tackle this problem from multiple areas and multiple fronts.
Great, that sounds great. So there's this quote by punk rock musician and activist Yotam Ophir that I love. He says, like, "Don't hate the media, be the media." And yeah, and it's pretty easy to get to feel sort of disempowered, in the face of all of the challenges in recent years, right? And when I was a kid, I was involved in a school shooting happened at my middle school, and it was real kind of foundational sort of experience. And then fast forward to 2012 with Sandy Hook's shooting, right? And 26 folks murdered, 20 of them children. And then the total misinformation campaign that followed that through InfoWars that we were just talking about. And so this led me in my own art and design practice to create a project that I'm here to share with you today, is called Alternative Rule. And this project is a platform for protesting commemoration. And so it looks like a it looks like a blank piece of paper, this alternative ruled paper that we all learned to write our cursive writing when we were children, with this sort of dotted line in between a pair of red lines. And then this project, I use a print technology called microprint. So all of the structures that look like ruled lines on the paper are actually microprinted text. and they contain the details, names and details of individual children who've been killed or injured in gun violence from Columbine to as close to the present as I could get. And so I've been distributing this paper widely, mailing it all across the country, and then hosting letter writing direct action campaigns where activists use the paper to write members of government, people who are influencing policy, to advocate for reform in the relationship, Americans' relationship to guns. And yeah, and so that's a project that I'm working on now. So the idea here is to take a form that looks blank and unassuming and use it as a sort of Trojan horse to smuggle this unacknowledged information into the hands of people who are crafting policy in our country.
And in our own sense here, I'm a social psychologist, and knowing the ground upon which radicalization sprouts is a really important thing. Okay, what makes people susceptible to these things? And a number of the projects we work with, we sit down with, former Aryan supremacists and say, what made you former? But what made you Aryan supremacist in the first place? What are the things and the factors that are associated with this? Prior to that, it was terrorists, Al-Qaeda. What makes this appealing to people? Yeah, in this way. And there's some cultural factors, there's other individual factors that go into all this kind of stuff. And if you understand that a little bit, this can help in terms of what you might do with the information. One of the things, and Lindsay and Yini have certainly alluded to this, telling somebody you're an idiot hardens the point of view. And one of the things you learn talking to the Aryan supremacists, that's actually is what gives them strength. They know everyone hates us, and so we have to stick together because we have the truth. And the fact that people are calling us idiots actually makes us stronger. And when you look at them who become Aryan supremacists, they all have a very similar story. The guy at work, a woman at work, they're black, I hate black people, but yet this person was nice to me. And they kept being nice to me no matter how much I hated them. And then I started thinking, why do I hate this person? And then, so there's sort of this empathic bond that sort of comes along the way. And then if I don't hate this person, then why do I hate all the people who are like them? And it sort of breaks that way. So a number of these people, some of this with the FBI, some of this with Homeland Security, basically go onto these sites and look for these vulnerable people and trying to basically shift that narrative before they fall susceptible to whatever sort of Aryan supremacist message that comes along at that. So that's one of the things to try to, understand as far as trying to get messages. And that's what sometimes makes, how do you frame that message? Because I think as academics, we're used to the, data persuades us. That's the currency we deal with. So you give me some facts. Oh, all right. Yeah, then I'll change my mind. But that doesn't work that way in a lot of other things. And I think a lot of us here understand this, and some of the speakers here today as well. And so trying to understand what is the particular sandbox you're playing in terms of how you can get people to move away from some of this really extreme stuff that unfortunately causes, just, so much destruction within the particular country. But again, a lot of the principles, whether you're talking Al-Qaeda, whether you're talking Aryans, they're very similar as far as the recruitment process goes.
Thank you all. I want to talk about, to focus our discussion on conducting research into extremism for a moment. And Mark, you talked about a ground from which extremism can rise. From your experience and your work, where are those extremists online? Where should we look up for them? What are the most promising platforms or online locations where extremism flourishes?
In my own stuff, I'm not exactly sure what some of these are, but the folks that we deal with, they know where they are. So you get into poor communities. You look at some of the sociologists out here, right? Social structures. You know, William Julius Wilson wrote his book about, you know, in the city, in the poor environments, in the urban. And it turns out those same principles, you put them in a white community in West Virginia, and you get exactly the same type of social pathology, right, that goes into that. And those are the folks, and someone who will then speak to them and tell them, no, no, here's why you're good, and here's why, and it's this person's fault, it's that person's fault, and so on and so forth. And they're the ones who become susceptible to those things. I think now, again, since I don't study it in the media, I know in the 4chan and the 8chan, and a lot of them go under into those particular discussions. And so that's what a lot of these guys now do. They go into those particular chat rooms wherever they are and try to sort of disabuse them of those particular notions and to try so they don't get susceptible to those groups. And then of course there's the algorithms from other studies you see that you know, I think I saw something the other day where it was like how many clicks before all of a sudden you're at a area supremacist or a website, right? You know, half a dozen, 8, something like that. It was some like remarkable number because, you know, part of the clicks is to get you keep you emotional. The more you're emotional, the more you're online, right? That's the magic formula. That's Fox News. That's everybody. You know, when you get people emotions and they stop thinking on that. And so that's what it typically does. And before you know it, again, you can be there. These individuals could be there before you know it.
Yeah, and the algorithms, I think we misunderstood them for a few years when people thought about social media in let's say 2011, 2010. We talked about filter bubbles, right? The idea that algorithms will only show you information that you already agree with, sort of a modern echo chamber of sorts. But actually, it doesn't seem to be the case. And I think Mark is exactly on point. The algorithms are not trying to show you things that you agree with. They try to show you things that engage you. And engagement is not necessarily coming from things that you love. I can watch discussion by a professor from somewhere on misinformation, and then YouTube will suggest to me a Jordan Peterson video or a Joe Rogan video, because it understands that I'm interested in those topics and I'm going to get enraged by it, but still, you know, communicate with it and watch it and share it and comment on it and so on. I want anyone wants to add about where do you seek Lindsay? We work on some interesting data sets.
Yeah, we've been working on some data sets from 4chan and 8chan, which is kind of a known place, a known breeding ground for these types of things in the politically incorrect boards. But I think even broader than that, I mean, these folks use social media that are mainstream too, and I mean, many of the things that you sort of mentioned here at the beginning regarding Twitter kind of brought many of them back to mainstream social media as well, kind of away from these things like Telegram and Rumble and whatnot. And actually, Yotam, I don't know if you know this, but your former mentor, Gabriel Wyman, published a paper recently about the Internet Archive. Are you familiar with this paper? He was really cool paper showing that there is a whole host of extremist material that has sort of been deplatformed that exists on the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine. This sort of project that's used to kind of catalog the internet, because if you think about websites that, you know, maybe this is scary, but websites that you maybe created in like early 2000s don't exist anymore. So isn't that sad? Shouldn't we be able to access them in some way as sort of like an artifact of history? And so your live journal, for instance, could, you know, maybe still be out there somewhere if you had one of those. But anyway, the fact that lots of extremist websites maybe were deplatformed and are still active on the Internet Archive, you can still go to them and view their material. Many extremists know this, and so they go and kind of get information about, you know, how did this previous group conduct their activities, and how did this previous group kind of recruit their members. It's an unfortunate kind of leverage of this really great research tool and great, you know, historical artifact that unfortunately the bad guys also know about.
I'll add a couple of things because I always talk to myself, so I'll answer my own question here. One thing to remember is that for those who want to engage with misinformation, is that the availability of data keeps changing. So until recently, Twitter was available to all of us to scrape through the API. And as you know, Elon Musk decided that academic research is not a priority anymore for Twitter. And researchers, including all of us, needing to update our repositories and resources. The second thing I want to say is that especially those who are not from the field, you may not be familiar with how deep the internet is. How what we know and think of as the internet is just the tip of the iceberg. And then underneath there is a massive amount of websites, some of which are protected by passwords and all kind of things like that, like the deep web. But even open access platforms that most of us never heard of, where extremist groups are operating in. My research team had been looking a lot into Stormfront, which is a neo-Nazi forum that's been around for 20 years. And you can get to Stormfront from Google. I mean, you can search stuff and get to Stormfront. You don't need any special equipment. The last thing I want to say about sources of misinformation is that I want to acknowledge, because my opening speech highlighted the problem we have with the far right, I want to acknowledge that there are extremist groups on the left, of course. For moments in time in our history, the left was the more violent and contrarian side. I'm not arguing in any way that misinformation or extremism is a right-wing only problem. I am arguing that at the current moment in time, most of our concerns with domestic terrorism and extremism comes from the right. But I want to acknowledge that. And I want to acknowledge that as a researcher, because maybe we are missing some of the extremism on the left side because we keep looking for extremism on the right side. So let's keep that in mind as well. All right, so continuing with the questions that have to do with our work, not necessarily in research, but in the art world as well. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges that people who study or engage with misinformation need to confront, including and if you can talk a little bit about the mental toll that it takes to read through pages upon pages of anti-Semitic, misogynistic, violent content.
I could maybe start. So when about compiling the data set that would become alternative rule, it became apparent that because of the Dickey Amendment that restricted the CDC's ability to research firearm deaths as a legitimate public health crisis, that really the labor of consolidating this data set really fell into the hands of kind of a loose group of NGOs who are collecting this information. And so only I think in 2020 did the federal government sort of shake loose of the NRA's control in order to be able to fund and study firearms as a legitimate health crisis. And so that just as far as sources go. And then, yeah, I'd say the other thing is like trying to escape maybe the attention economy, trying to look at alternatives to chasing this sort of outrage engine that's feeding so much of the, the work on Twitter and other platforms.
It's interesting when you think of where do you get good information and how does this work, right? So where? Well, we think what academia is a good place. Science, right? All agree. Government, maybe even media. But those are Rush Limbaugh's four corners of deceit. So there's a whole section of the country that have been basically told, these are the people who will lie to you. Right. So how do you operate under that particular environment? Right. That becomes, and the other thing is, people can lie with accurate information, just take it out of context, right? So I was watching an unnamed cable network, and it was the Blue City crime wave. Blue City crime wave, Blue City crime wave, all day long, right? The rate 22%, 25% increase in crime. Well, it turns out the rural areas outside of those blue cities have exactly the same crime increase. But the whole framing of it was, what's wrong with the blue cities? Here's what's wrong with the Democrats, so on and so forth. That number was accurate, though. They weren't lying about the information. But by pulling that out of context, you end up misleading people. And that is one of the things about life. You can mislead with accurate information along the way. And that becomes yet another challenge to this whole thing. So when we think of misinformation, sometimes I think our first instinct is, well, it's got to be something inaccurate. But it can be accurate stuff. And sometimes every so often, then that kind of like keeps the people who are susceptible to it engaged, because every so often, like the stop clock, they get some accurate info.
In terms of the challenges of studying misinformation and extremism, I think definitely trauma is one important aspect of the research process. So like 2 years ago, I had a research assistant who is an undergrad student code a bunch of tweets for me. Basically, that is for a project on like very negative expression towards immigrants in the United States. And that student has an immigrant parent. So like reading those tweets that are pretty like, I would say dark, that are pretty offensive, I think caused some, I think steep like a trauma for him. So I think this is definitely one important aspect that we have been ignoring over the years. Like we did not like pay much attention to the trauma, studying extremism and studying misinformation can have on researchers. So I think that is definitely one challenge for me. I'd be curious to know how to better navigate that area, because I do want to do research in a way that does not harm, my mental health and my research assistant's mental health. I think that is one challenge. Another challenge is definitely data, as you pointed out, because a lot of misinformation and extremism, I think, are spread online. And in recent years, I think a lot of social media platforms, although have tried to make data access easier for researchers, but more recently, there has been a lot of like rolling back of those efforts, like Twitter, like Reddit. I think Reddit is now like tightening its API access.
Facebook after Cambridge.
Right, Facebook, and then I think a CrowdTangle. Facebook used to like create CrowdTangle in order to better serve journalists and researchers, but recently, there has been a lot of problems with that platform. So I think data is one important challenge in my research. So basically, I think researchers have but in general, two approaches to collect data. The first one would be like collecting data directly from social media platforms, and that can be, I would say, very much affected by the policies of social media platforms. One day Elon Musk decided that, okay, he's gonna take down the access, so that can cause a huge problem for us. The other approach would be like getting data from like a commercial data broker, but the challenge with that is that we don't know like how data brokers collected their data, and then the data collection process might not be transparent to us. For example, we've been working with a data broker called Synthesio on a bunch of projects. We've been asking them like how they collected Facebook data, how they collected Twitter and YouTube data. They couldn't give us a satisfactory answer. Even after like back and forth email exchanges. So it's hard. I think that has been like a long-term challenge for me.
Matt, you want to chime in on challenges in your area?
Yeah, well, the challenge is how to represent the casualties and the scale of the problem without reducing individuals to like an abstract data point, right? And so in art and design, we have a lot of memorials as examples, maybe like Maya Lin's Vietnam memorial would be an example where, you approach the sculpture of this, it's carved in this beautiful black stone. And as you get close enough to be able to read the names carved into it, you're also kind of confronted with your reflection, right? And so I think that sort of inversion is an interesting strategy in connecting people to this sort of sense of loss and scale. Of course, but there's a big glaring hole in this, right? Because we created Maya Lin created a memorial for only one side of the American war in Vietnam, right? And so, so with alternative rule, the idea was to create something of a circulating memorial that could be updated, added to as needed, but something that wasn't site specific and something that could go under the noses of people in power and into the hands of activists and create a kind of generative paranoia in the minds of maybe people in power and making policy.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about what Yini said. My team actually, we stopped working with undergraduate research assistants on Stormfront because I felt bad about throwing them into this hot garbage of racism and misogyny, and many times our undergrads are themselves minorities, and they say it's okay, I can deal with it, but they don't know what they're getting into. I think until you spend some time in Gab or 4chan or Stormfront, you don't understand what extremism looks like. It's very, very, very ugly. And when we do work with students, we actually try to arrange meetings with them once in a while to talk to them and see if they're doing well and like if they, take it all and so on. And finally, I will say that I work with a lot of people who study extremism, and all of them told me in one way or another that they're going to a therapist on a pretty regular basis to cope with what they study. So those traumas that you're referring to are real. It's not an exaggeration in any way.
Just to add to that too, there's also sometimes you can sort of almost try to dissociate yourself a little bit from it. And you really have to try to like focus on here's the bigger goal. So, I've had an opportunity to meet face to face with some extremists, including have coffee with a Klansman, right? It was part of an FBI project. It wasn't like, my Saturday night. The whole purpose of this particular project was to get into the mindset. How do they think? How do they process their world? And it's not the same. And so you just keep saying to yourself, all right, well, this is the greater goal we're trying to get to on this. And so to try to disassociate from that, it's not perfect, but it helps you get to that. I talked to a number of homicide cops and I said, how do you deal with the bodies? And they said, well, it's just another piece of evidence. This is the person, but that thing that we found in the woods is just a piece of evidence. And that's how they try to psychologically keep themselves a little bit cleaner on this. But the ability in their minds to do this stuff. So for example, with the one Klansman story, I had asked them why he chose the name, the KKK party, whatever he's running. And I said, don't you think it comes, because we weren't allowed to like criticize him or debate him. We just wanted to talk to him, right? And it's like, why did you choose that name? And he said, and I said, and he said, why? And he looked at me straight and I said, well, it kind of comes with some baggage, don't you think? And his response was, well, how do you know? Were you there? I wasn't there. You weren't there. How do you know this happened? Blah, blah, blah. So that was the thing. And then later, as the conversation went on, as they invariably do, well, I'm not anti-black. I'm just pro-white. So they land there, right? And I said, well, why? And he said, well, white people did all this stuff. And he starts going through the list. And I could not help myself. So I said, well, how do you know? Were you there? Now, normally, here's the thing, but this is the interesting part. Normally at that moment, when you catch somebody in a real clear, blatant, there's that little moment, the eyes get a little wide, they go, what? As they're trying to get out of the hole they just did. Zero, none. He just looked at me like I had a third eye. Like, what are you talking about? How do you not know this? Absolutely unbothered by this sort of massive contradiction. And so this ability to trying to, filter and deal with information like this, that's a challenge. But it also, it gets in your mind unless you try to say, all right, we're going to try to figure out how to deal with this and try to separate it from that individual that, but as you can tell, I hadn't forgotten that. And that was about 10 years ago. So.
Yeah, I'll add to that I think another challenge we didn't talk about is that if you study misinformation, you're going to get arrested and attacked. You need to be ready for it, at least. Sometimes it's just a researcher who studies political topics. You can get harassed for no good reason. Ray, my student, got an email right from a participant who was angry at us that we were biased liberals or something, although our experiment was completely like disconnected from any specific ideologies. I myself got harassed many times. I'm getting used to it as well. So people harass me over email and then on my Facebook page or on Twitter, and that's fine. I'm kind of used to it by now. I'm also Jewish, so when I talk about neo-Nazis, they're not fans. And it is true that people of color and women are harassed more. So it's something that to keep on your mind when you study something like that. I was actually attacked here at UB, not physically, but by a student a week ago. I gave a talk at the sustainability program, and I think I did a pretty good job talking about misinformation using only evidence-based arguments. And then a student, raised his hand and said, "Everything you just said right now, was that science or propaganda?" And he didn't let go. Like I tried to dismantle it, and he didn't let go. So it's part of the job, and it's uncomfortable, and it can be really scary at times. But again, I think we all feel like what we're doing is important enough to see through it. All right. Let's move to a more practical kind of questions. All of us want to make the world slightly less worse and less terrible, and we are trying to help others. What do you think individuals can do based on your research and activity? What can individuals do to avoid spreading misinformation?
I can chime in first. Yeah, so I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I guess just sort of a story about kind of why I think what I think. We in studying some of this really dark stuff and trying to understand what on a cognitive level leads people to adopt these terrible beliefs and eventually these terrible behaviors, we kind of came to the conclusion that like understanding all of this stuff is great, but if we're not doing anything about it, we're not really maybe being the best citizens. And so one portion of our research is trying to say that, okay, look, we understand that morality and that these like threat cues that, an outgroup is threatening is really crucial to kind of getting people to extremist beliefs and to performing, extremist behaviors and including violence. But so how do we bring them back then? And one of the things that we've tried to do in the past is use morality kind of preemptively to say that, can I convince you before you are exposed to this propaganda, before you're exposed to this terrorist propaganda, can I convince you that this group is wrong, is morally wrong? And then if you come across their propaganda or their information in media in an everyday kind of setting, would you be more likely to kind of maybe say no and not let that change your beliefs? And so, for instance, if you're we tell you ahead of time that immigration is actually not going to replace US American citizens in the job market, would you be less likely to be susceptible to great replacement theory logic? And when we've tried to do this in the past, one of the things that we've consistently found is that you can't persuade people back with morality, because if you try to situate things in morality, it just makes them mad. And when things are sort of morally charged, or maybe to some of Mark's research, emotionally charged, lots of facts and convincing people based on evidence is much more difficult. And so the thing that I always say to people is that you really can't, if you're trying to kind of be a better citizen and combat misinformation in lots of these conspiracy theory ways, or even kind of political ideology, violence kind of ways, the best way to do it is really to confront people with facts and evidence. And so the problem with this, and as Mark just alluded to, is that when you are confronting people that have these really deep-seated beliefs, facts often also don't work. And so there's these other sort of small things that maybe Mark's research might speak to that can kind of get to bring them back. But it's an issue we're still grappling with that unfortunately I do not have a good answer to.
Perhaps our biggest achievement in the study of misinformation over the last 40 years or so is departing from the deficit model. the idea that people are just ignorant, and if you give them more information, you just tell them more, you make the warning label on tobacco packages bigger, they won't smoke or do bad things. Sorry, yeah, go on.
Well, with the sort of misinformation and conspiracy, there's often a kind of something that's posing as a close read of a text or an image or a video, right? We see this with this kind of InfoWars crazies who are frame by frame going through an image to say that such and such is a body double of a politician or something like this. And so also just to, as the one artist and designer here, to put a pitch in for, like, there is a field of expertise in the humanities and the arts that has expertise in close reading and visual analysis of films, literature, image and text. That's kind of our bag, right? And I think that not just learning the powers of close reading, but also making media. Like, so, every intro to film student sees film differently when they, after the experience of cutting their first film, like they didn't see edits until they had to make edits. And so I think at this time when sometimes the humanities and the arts are being undervalued in our universities and in our society, it's important to remember that in making sense of images and making sense of text and all of the polyvalent layered readings of those important cultural objects, like there's a place for this in resisting the creep of of poisonous fascist ideas by by reinvigorating a true close reading of these images and texts. And I think, this sort of conspiracy folks are posing, right? They're coming to these images already with ideas and have major kind of confirmation bias when they're pretending to examine images. And if put next to the actual, people who have expertise in this, I think, I would side with the humanities and the arts. And I don't think that this is something that necessarily can be outsourced to algorithms or done in real time. And I think our interest in those technological solutions are actually, part of the kind of cultural problem.
Yeah, a couple of interesting issues here, and I think one of the things, Lindsay, is there may be, I've been dealing with like the dead enders who might be immune to the data, and I'm sure people are on maybe a scale of how deep down the rabbit hole, so that but even if you do that, a good percentage, even you can convert that, I think that's very much a worthwhile endeavor, right? To keep the numbers down. As far as like I said, the nature of the problem, one of the things about the information that's out there, sometimes it is, I think Matt was talking about, it looks good, right? And this is how a con artist works, right? The con artist is going to convince you they're very rich and they own a building in New York and they're going to sell you the building. That was an actual con. One of the guys on the show, it was one of his cons. He sold someone a building he didn't own. But he has, wears the expensive clothes. He comes in on a private jet. This is from money he stole from other people, by the way. But he doesn't come out and say, I'm a rich guy, right? And one of the things, if you make the information look real, because when someone says, am I lying or not? You kind of look, okay, do I believe this person? But when they allow you to lie to yourself, so they're wearing all the rich stuff, they got the expensive jewelry and everything. So when you come to the conclusion, oh, this person must be rich. So if you you tend not to challenge your own self. And then you take it at face value, right? So this is part of the disguise, the stage management that goes into a con. And I think the information that goes online can sometimes be like that. It takes on the appearance of stuff, looks like something of a certain amount of credibility. I think understanding the process helps a lot. In looking up a guy I knew from the Intel community, he was doing a little interview, and I got into the YouTube vortex, and I actually found myself, the US government put out a little information film about 17 minutes long, I think from 1947, about it can happen here. Starts out with some guy in a street corner blaming, immigrants and all sorts of folks. And then this other guy who experienced the Nazis goes through and talks about how this happens. along the way. And that just struck me as being like really modern, even though it was, you know, the US government put it out in 1947. And I think understanding that process and then what somebody's role might be in that, and if you are doing this stuff, you recognize how you might be a cog in that system, that might be another way. My own way, I wish we could do this though. I wish we could put like warning labels. When I stopped playing, I don't play video games, but I remember I did for about 15 minutes back in the 90s. And I think it was Doom, you know, and like when you got weak, like your characters like slowly started changing color, like to red or whatever. You didn't have so much strength. And I think every like TV pundit should be like color coded like that. So when a talking head shows up on TV, you can say, oh, here's their credibility, here's their, you know, accuracy rate, whatever. Because they have done studies with that. I think Hamilton College did this one where they looked at TV pundits and anything they said that was predictable, and they could rate them on who's more accurate and who's. Paul Krugman from the New York Times was actually the most accurate. And then there was a conservative guy who passed away, Cal Thomas, was the least at the time. But it would be really cool. You turn on, oh, here's a guy, oh yeah, they're only, you know, 50%, or oh, this other pundit's an 80%, or something like that. I don't know how you do it, but that's a fantasy. What the heck?
If I could just add to that really quick, something you said explains a lot of misinformation that we've been dealing with a lot lately. We're using Breitbart articles as experimental stimuli to try to understand how people respond to great replacement logic. And one of the things that we keep coming across when we're trying to use these articles as stimuli is that they oftentimes never really come out and say immigration is the problem, or they never say migration is the problem. But what they do is instead is people are saying that migration is a problem. People are saying that immigrants are flooding over the border. Politicians do this too. Donald Trump did this a lot. People are saying that this is happening, and it's sort of like, no, you're saying that. But by framing it in this kind of fuzzy way, it's kind of like the reader is coming to their own conclusion that this is kind of the problem, and then it becomes this not a persuasion process necessarily, but this I don't know, kind of active realization that they're making the reader come into. I don't know, just had an epiphany there.
There are artists, I'm thinking of your idea of the pundits. There are artists like a buddy of mine, Ben Grosier, who creates the artwork is a form of a web browser plugin. And one of his most popular ones is called Twitter Demetricator. And what it does is it hides all of the metrics from the user experience on Twitter. And so you're able to read like a post, but you don't have access to how many people who have retweeted it or liked it or something like this. And so I think that, again, that idea that, there are, there are options maybe at the individual level where they're not necessarily like bubbles, but they're ways of further controlling and mediating the experience of others, so-called appreciation of whatever is being circulated. And so you can download this and put it on your own computer, and then do a kind of test to see how much your own experience of an article or an event is mediated by people in your network who've been circulating it or responding to it. It's kind of interesting. It reminds me a little bit of the in the film They Live, where he finds a pair of sunglasses and puts it on and is able to see, this classic science fiction film, is able to see through a kind of mediated environment to a kind of subtext of ideology that's all around him.
All right. So some people are saying that it's been a long day and it's getting late. So I think we're going to stop here, and thank you again for joining us. And if you have questions, we have about 15 minutes for a Q&A. Thank you. David.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your perspectives. This is really what makes CII such a special place, to have all of you coming together and shedding light on this huge problem and provide ideas for potential solutions, even if they are partial solutions. My question comment has to do with a bit of contextualization. Yotam did, I think, a great job reminding us that the problem of misinformation that we experience right now is both new and old. It's new in the sense of possibly scale and the stakes, and it's old in the sense that a lot of the issues that we associate with the spread of corrupt information are not new at all. They come from, as far back as ancient history, or as you said, the lies we told ourselves since we started talking, right? But something that is some in between here has to do with the specific context of our socioeconomic environment. I'm thinking of how we have created an information environment in which the erosion of the quality of information is something to be expected. We shouldn't be surprised. I don't think of misinformation necessarily as an anomaly, but sort of a logical result of a socioeconomic environment that is predicated on certain principles, values, actions, and non-actions. What Yotam referred to as the Reagan years, maybe a specific example, a specific moment in time that can be an illustration of this. But I think we have been traveling along a road with the way we have organized structural global economy, in which we should not be surprised anymore about the continued success of misinformation spreading machines. It is, in my view, the logical result of the system we have created. So I just would want a reaction to that notion from anyone.
I in the kind of discussion of like surveillance capitalism, sometimes this phrase like data is the new oil is tossed around, right? And this idea of like the surveillance capitalism, like sort of hoovering up all of our data through our transactions online, from reading the news to buying things online or something like that, that this data becomes valuable, or it's warehoused and sort of stored for some future where perhaps it can be refined and used. So I think finding creative ways to sort of resist that, and to look at it as like problematic in the terms of oil extraction, and is problematic in a direct kind of environmental way, to think about maybe even borrowing some of those metaphors from environmentalism about ways the polluter pays, and ideas of like what would like a Superfund site to clean up the mess that the sort of fascist forever chemicals that have been put into the circulatory system from the last election, like so I'm interested in those kind of ideas, and I think I was thinking of Dahlia's talk about this idea of impossible, and then this like phrase from '68 that said be reasonable, like demand the impossible, right? And if like the craziest thing we can think of is like a taxation on tech companies or something like that, then I don't think we're being radical or big enough. And and if one side has claim to these kind of radical gestures, then we're kind of screwed, I feel like.
Go on.
I think speaking of the larger like factors that contribute to misinformation, I agree with you that the spread of misinformation and the rise of extremism are, I would say, inevitable byproducts of the larger social economic environment. I want to highlight one factor, that is the decline of trust in all kinds of things. Over the years since Watergate, maybe the general public has declining trust in government institutions institutions, in media outlets. So I think the declining trust, erosion of trust in institutions and organizations, I think play a huge role in people turning their attention, putting their trust on, like influencers or political leaders or demagogues. So that's one thing. Another thing, maybe paranoia. I think with regard to the recent shootings, like the one that took place in upstate New York, like a man shoot a person who got on his driveway. So I think it's another. I think paranoia is another reflection of declining trust in people and in like our fellow citizens. So I think that can also contribute to how like people like might increasingly turn to online sources and to people who might not have the necessary credential, but who put out information that sounds like palatable to them.
Yeah, and just real quick too, there's also malign actors involved, right? In the Intel world, they don't create the cracks, but they exploit them. And so, the Russians and so on and so forth are masters at this. So they will just jump in and start to, push and widen that crack as much as they can. And by the way, they're not the only ones out there. That's been done. So yeah, that becomes another issue. So it's not just simply, the stuff getting out there, but actual malign actors out there doing the best they can to, create these differences, exploit them, and make them sound as awful as possible.
I could just add really quickly to that too. Sorry, super quick. That on a zoomed in level, if you think about evolutionarily speaking, we're kind of predisposed to respond to threat. We want to pay attention to threat, and so when you have actors on social media or on the news or politicians telling you there's this threat, you must pay attention to it, and the rest of everybody else isn't talking about that threat, of course we're going to pay attention to this person because we're predisposed to it. And when you've seen that nobody's doing anything about this threat that you now believe is real, well, of course you're going to act, right? So when you kind of put it in that way, it's you can see the logic behind why some of these people maybe respond to this information in the way that they do, whether or not it's good for society.
And of course, media outlets like Fox News keep telling us that the civil war is imminent and feeding this paranoia. However, I myself, one of you talked about McLuhan, and I'm a bit skeptic about McLuhan's idea that media have to be necessarily good or bad for societies. And I want to remind everybody that many use the media to fight misinformation and to promote good causes. I mean, we spend a lot of time saying how bad the media are, but Black Lives Matter would not be as successful without Twitter, and the Me Too movement will not be as successful without Twitter. And these days you have Gen Z teenagers who are trying to fight for climate policy on TikTok and things like that. For example, again, the Willow Project and all those things. So let's remember that media are not necessarily good or bad. It's us and what we do with it. We have time for one more question. If
I have the mic,
somebody
so I'm going to ask
Yep.
it. You may not know the answer to this, but I'm curious. So these extremist communities that you all study, I assume they have some kind of leadership or more active people or some people who sit at kind of nodal points in a sociological web. Do these people share hold the beliefs that they advance, or do they have other motivations? I mean, do they want followers because they consider themselves to be prophets, or because they want power or wealth or some other, this is a means to an end?
Yeah, all of the above. Seriously, there's some, it's profit. It's like, hey, suckers, buy my supplements. And I just said this really stupid thing and these people are buying. Great, let's go. And they just keep pushing. And this is what you also see again, is it's characteristic of the con artist. There are some who soundly believe this in sort of a deranged way as well. So it may require different strategies for dealing with these different individuals along the way. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the best way is, but I think, yeah, you do see these varied motives. One of the things that came out of that 1947 U.S. government film was they always said, somebody who's trying to get, they'd mentioned, the Nazis were a minority, yet they controlled the whole country. And part of it was getting all the little other groups to hate each other in some way. And so while they're fighting with each other, they're able to basically run the ship. But they had a little line in there, but when somebody tries to tell you to hate this, they're getting something from this. They're, and sort of and this was part of the counter message, is that nobody's just doing this to do it. And so, and I thought that was kind of interesting because I think that would spark, some of the skepticism in someone. Yeah, what are they getting out of this? And maybe that becomes part of the mechanism to get people to stop to believe it or whatever. But
if I could just add to that, we've done some work with studying terrorist groups, groups that have acted violently in the United States in support of some political goal, non-state actors. And one of the things that we find in studying them is that everything is propaganda, and that they're always on. Leaders are always on. They know that people are watching. And so the ways in which that they present their cause is very, what do I want people to think about this? So answering your question is extremely difficult of do they believe this or not? Because in order to know that, you would have to probably ask them. And based on Mark's research, will they give you the correct answer? Probably not. So I think it is all of the above. But yeah, one of the kind of many annoying things about studying this is that you don't know whether you're studying the kind of PR of it, or are you studying the actual beliefs that they hold.
Briefly add that I agree that it's hard to impute motives. It's hard to infer what the true motives behind their actions are, but we can see what the outcomes are, like either status or money or fame. At least using social media, by hijacking the attention economy. I think a lot of actors who spread extreme speech, extreme ideas, rise to fame, and they can, by the way, they can make a lot of money out of it, like Alex Jones did. Does that too.
Yeah, and maybe also for us to look at our role in the debate as well. If we're using terms like fake news instead of propaganda, or if we're allowing these sort of leaders, whether or not they believe in it, to frame the discussion and craft the language PR, old Edward Bernays, and Lutz and all these strategists who, are changing the verbiage for, climate change, radicalism. Even how do we talk about the riots or insurrection at the Capitol? How does, are we creating the language that's framing it, or are we allowing them to frame it through the kind of construction of language? And again, just to make another pitch for the arts and humanities, because reframing problems and approaching it sort of oblique angles is one of the skills. And so if we find a culture that if we become a culture that's just a group of engineers and looking at people as data points, then we essentially lose a kind of immune system to these things. That's my thought. Yeah.
One more quick point on that too, is these leaders often surround themselves with individuals and the yes people, right? This is how you get the affection of it. You become the true believer. And so they never get accurate information. Everything is filtered through the people around them. So they always think they're right. I saw an interview with Trump says, I'll make some up. I'm not really sure, but I'm always right. But because they surround themselves with yes people, no one's going to contradict them. And, you think of like Vladimir Putin and a few other people in those particular organizational structures that's just going to keep pushing in extreme because there's nobody there to push back and say, maybe I'll try this.
Okay, I don't want to hold people for too long. I have a very heavy responsibility here on my shoulders to say the last sentence of the first symposium of CII. And we know from psychological research that the last thing you're going to hear is what you're going to take with you. So I'm going to do something untypical and be optimistic. We've heard a lot of bad stuff today from the moment we arrived until the moment we're going to leave. But I'm going to be optimistic. The great folk singer Woody Guthrie had a sticker on his guitar that said, "This machine kills fascists." by which he of course meant art and the human soul. And I love it so much that I have it on my computer somewhere here, because I think our research and the art that you create in your studio and all that this center is doing help us win against those really scary forces that surround us. So I think we should all be grateful for the work done in the Center for Information Integrity, and we should continue to fight for a better, healthier, cleaner information environment. So thank you all for coming in today, and we can continue discussing all of these in the happy hour. Thanks.
Yeah. It's not disinformation.
Yeah,